Don't embarrass me tonight. My stepmother's voice was barely above a whisper, but it cut through the noise of the hotel lobby like a blade. She adjusted the pearl necklace at her throat without looking at me. These are important people. Just smile, stay quiet, and try not to draw attention to yourself. I smoothed the front of my dress, a simple emerald green wrap that I'd bought on sale 8 months ago, and said nothing. My half-sister Claire floated past us in a gown that cost more than my monthly car payment, her hair pinned up by someone whose sole job that morning had been pinning up hair. She glanced at me once, the way you glance at furniture. "You look fine," she said, which was not a compliment. This was Claire's engagement party. A pre-wedding celebration hosted at the Whitmore Grand, one of those hotels where the doormen wear white gloves and the chandeliers are older than most American states. My stepmother, Diane, had spent 11 months planning it. Guest list, 240 people, every one of them connected to either my stepfather's real estate empire or Claire's fiancé's family, the Ashfords, whose name appeared on 3 buildings in downtown Boston. I was there because I was family. Technically. "Remember," Diane said, touching my arm as we walked toward the ballroom, her fingers barely making contact, "tonight is about Claire. Not you." I almost laughed. As if I had ever made anything about me in that house. What Diane didn't know, what none of them knew, was that I had spent the last 14 months quietly, methodically building something that was about to walk into that ballroom before I did. I was 31 years old. My name is Nora. And I had been the invisible daughter long enough. I need to back up, because none of this makes sense without the context of growing up in the Hargrove house. My mother passed when I was 9. My father remarried 2 years later Diane, who was pleasant enough in public and glacially polite at home. She had one daughter, Claire, who was 7 months older than me and had her father's last name on a building at her private school because he'd donated the library. My father loved me. I believe that. But love, in our house, looked like not making waves. It looked like letting Diane decide which events mattered and which didn't, which achievements got framed on the wall and which got a quiet "that's nice, honey" over dinner. Claire's debate trophies were displayed in the living room. My full academic scholarship to Northwestern was mentioned once, at breakfast, and then the conversation moved on to Claire's semester in Florence. I didn't grow up angry. I grew up quiet and driven in a way that had nowhere obvious to go, so it went inward, then outward, into work. After Northwestern, I got a master's in environmental policy at Georgetown. Then I joined a small nonprofit called the Meridian Climate Collective, not because it paid well, it didn't, but because the work mattered. We partnered with corporations to restructure their sustainability commitments, design actual accountability frameworks, not the performative kind companies put in annual reports to make shareholders feel warm. Over 3 years, I led negotiations that redirected over $40 million in corporate funding toward verified climate infrastructure. Our model got written up in the Harvard Business Review. I was asked to speak at Davos. I declined because I had a deadline and then asked again, and I went. None of this came up at Christmas dinner. But that was fine. I had stopped needing it to. What I had not stopped needing, somewhere quiet and stubborn inside me, was for my family to see me. Just once. Fully. The Whitmore Grand Ballroom was exactly as overwhelming as Diane had designed it to be. Orchids everywhere. A string quartet in the corner playing something that sounded like money. The Ashford family had arrived in force. Claire's fiancé, Preston, was handsome in the effortless way of men who have never worried about anything, and his parents, Richard and Margaret Ashford, moved through the room like people who expected it to rearrange itself for them. Richard Ashford, I knew from my work, was the chairman of Ashford Capital Group, a private equity firm that had recently come under significant public pressure for the environmental records of 3 of its portfolio companies. There had been an op-ed in the Times. There had been a Senate inquiry. And for the last 4 months, quietly, behind a series of NDAs and intermediaries, Ashford Capital had been in conversation with the Meridian Climate Collective about a landmark voluntary compliance partnership that would be the largest of its kind in the private equity sector. I was the lead architect of that partnership. Richard Ashford did not know that the woman leading those negotiations was going to be standing in his future daughter-in-law's engagement party in an emerald dress that cost $62. I found my seat toward the back, near the kitchen corridor, where Diane had arranged it and accepted a glass of sparkling water from a passing server. Across the room, Diane was introducing Claire to the Ashfords with the focused energy of a woman who had rehearsed this moment. Claire laughed at something Preston said. Margaret Ashford patted her hand. Richard Ashford scanned the room with the practiced ease of someone always calculating who in it was useful. His eyes passed over me without stopping. I took a sip of water and waited. Dinner was served in 3 courses. I was seated between one of Preston's cousins who talked exclusively about his boat and an elderly aunt of Diane's who fell asleep after the soup. At the main table, my stepmother was radiant with satisfaction. She caught my eye once across the room and gave me the small, tight smile she reserved for moments when she wanted me to know she was in control. My father sat beside her, looking happy in the vague, comfortable way he had perfected over 20 years of choosing peace over presence. He raised his glass toward me from across the room. I raised mine back. Then the microphone feedback cut through the string quartet, and the evening's MC, a family friend named Gerald who thought he was funnier than he was, stepped up to welcome everyone. He went through the expected remarks. The love story of Claire and Preston, the joining of 2 wonderful families. He thanked Diane for her extraordinary vision in creating this event. Diane dipped her head graciously. Then Gerald said, "And now, before we bring out dessert, we have a very special presentation. As many of you know, the Ashford Capital Group recently announced a landmark environmental partnership that's been making waves in both the business and policy worlds. Richard, would you like to say a few words?" Richard Ashford stood, buttoned his jacket, and walked to the microphone with the ease of a man who had given 1,000 speeches. "Thank you, Gerald. I'll keep this brief because I know we're all here for the couple." Warm laughter from the room. But I did want to take a moment to acknowledge something that became official this week. Ashford Capital has finalized its climate accountability partnership with the Meridian Climate Collective, a 14-month negotiation that I can honestly say changed how I think about the future of private equity and environmental responsibility. He paused. The person who made that happen, who sat across the table from our team for over a year and simply refused to let us off easy, is someone I've been wanting to meet in person for months. We've only ever spoken by video call. He looked out at the room. Her name is Nora Hargrove. I was told she might be here tonight. His eyes moved through the crowd. Is Nora here? The room turned. 240 heads. And at a table near the kitchen corridor, in an emerald dress from a sale rack, I set down my sparkling water and stood up. The silence lasted exactly 3 seconds before Richard Ashford said, "There she is," with something that sounded like genuine delight, and the room erupted. Diane's champagne glass stopped halfway to her mouth. My father blinked. Claire, for the first time all evening, looked directly at me. Richard crossed the room to shake my hand, which became one of those extended handshakes that turns into a conversation that turns into the rest of the evening reorganizing itself around you. "I have to ask," he said, low enough that only I could hear, "why didn't you tell us you'd be here?" "I didn't know if I was relevant enough to mention," I said. He laughed, a real one. "You redesigned our entire ESG framework. You're the most relevant person in this room." Margaret Ashford appeared at his elbow, extending her hand. "We've heard so much about you. Preston has been following your work since the HBR piece." Preston himself materialized, and then several of the Ashford Group's senior partners who apparently traveled in a formation, and within 20 minutes I was standing in a loose circle near the orchid centerpieces being asked questions. I actually knew how to answer. About carbon credit verification and accountability metrics, and what the Meridian model meant for other PE firms watching from the sidelines. I was aware, at the edges of my attention, of Diane. She had not moved from her seat. She held her champagne glass very still. My father had gotten up and was making his way across the room, slowly, with the expression of a man recalculating something significant. He reached me during a brief pause in the conversation, when Richard had been pulled aside by one of the hotel staff about a microphone issue. Nora. His voice was different. Lower. Something careful in it. Hi, Dad. He looked at me for a long moment. Around us, the party had resumed its noise, the string quartet back to their corner now that dinner was over. I didn't know, he said, about any of this. I know. I mean, I knew you worked in climate policy, but I didn't. He stopped. I didn't understand what that meant. I thought about all the Christmas dinners. All the times he had nodded pleasantly and let the subject change. All the times he had chosen the path of least resistance, which happened to run directly over me. You never asked, I said. Not with bitterness. Just as a fact. He absorbed that. His jaw moved slightly, the way it did when he was processing something he didn't want to be true. No, he said quietly. I didn't. Gerald was back at the microphone, calling people toward the dessert stations. The crowd shifted. My father stood still. I'm proud of you, he said. It landed strangely. Not wrong, but delayed. Like a letter that arrives months after the moment it was written for. Thank you, I said. And I meant it, in the way you can mean something and still feel the weight of how long it took. Diane found me by the coat check at the end of the evening. The party was winding down. Preston and Claire were taking photos with the last cluster of guests. My father had gone to get the car. The orchids were starting to wilt slightly at the edges, the way expensive things do when no one is looking anymore. Diane stopped in front of me and for a moment said nothing. She was still immaculate hair, posture, expression, but something behind her eyes had shifted, some small internal architecture that had been load-bearing all evening. You could have told me, she said finally. I tilted my head slightly. Told you what? That you were involved with the Ashfords. That this, she gestured vaguely at the space around us. That tonight was connected to your work. I considered that. Would it have changed where you seated me? She didn't answer immediately, which was its own answer. I've spent 11 months on this party, she said. There was something almost plaintive underneath the control. It was supposed to be Claire's night. It was Claire's night, I said. It still is. She's getting married to Preston. That didn't change. Diane looked at me with an expression I had never seen on her face before. Not warmth, exactly. More like the first moment of awareness that a room has more dimensions than you thought. You're not what I expected you to be, she said. No, I agreed. I'm not. I got my coat and walked out into the cold Boston night. I won't pretend the drive home felt triumphant. It didn't, not exactly. There was something clarifying about it, the kind of quiet that follows a long-held breath, finally released, but triumph implies someone lost, and I wasn't sure that was the story I wanted to be in anymore. I called my closest friend Maya from the car. She'd been texting me all evening with increasing desperation. Because I had told her where I was going, and she understood the full context in a way that required years of friendship to accumulate. Tell me everything, she said, before I'd said a word. I told her. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. How do you feel? I thought about it honestly. Like something finally got named that I didn't have a word for before. Are you okay? Yeah, I said. I actually am. 3 days later, my father called. Not a text. Not an email, a phone call, a Sunday morning, which was the kind of specific effort that told me he had been thinking about what to say. I want to take you to lunch, he said. Just us. No occasion. I want to hear about your work. What you actually do. What it means to you. I said yes. We went to a diner near my apartment, the kind with laminated menus and coffee that gets refilled without asking. My father looked slightly out of place in it, but he didn't suggest somewhere else, which I noticed. For 2 hours, I talked about Meridian, about the partnership with Ashford Capital and what it could mean for voluntary corporate climate accountability at scale, about the 14 months of negotiation and what I had learned about how institutions change slowly, reluctantly, and then all at once when something finally breaks through. He listened. Really listened, the way I hadn't seen him do in years, maybe ever. He asked questions, Not polite questions designed to keep the conversation moving, but actual questions, the kind that meant he had been paying attention to the last thing I said. At one point, he put his coffee cup down and said, "I used to think the most important thing I could give you was stability. A good home, good schools, not rocking the boat." He paused. "I think I confused stability with invisibility. And I made you carry that." The diner noise continued around us. Someone at the counter was arguing cheerfully about baseball. The coffee was slightly burned, the way diner coffee always is. "You didn't do it on purpose," I said. "That doesn't make it okay." "No," I agreed. "But it makes it human." He looked at me across the table, his daughter, who had apparently been building something extraordinary in plain sight for years while he watched the surface of things, and his eyes were wet in the way men of his generation rarely allow. "I'm sorry, Nora," he said. "For all of it." I reached across and put my hand over his. "I know," I said. "Now let's figure out what comes next." What came next was slower and more imperfect than any story wants to admit. Diane did not transform overnight. She remained who she was: controlled, protective of Claire, cautious with me. But something had shifted in the geometry of how she moved around me. She stopped the small, dismissive gestures. She started asking, occasionally, about my work, stilted questions that she clearly had to prepare, but she asked them. Claire and I had never been close, and we didn't suddenly become close. But the month after the engagement party, she texted me unprompted, out of nowhere, a link to an article about corporate greenwashing with a note that said, "Thought of you. Is this the stuff you fight against?" I stared at that text for a full minute before I wrote back. "Yes, exactly this." We had a real conversation, maybe our first, in the comments thread of a link sent by my half-sister who had mostly ignored me for 25 years. It wasn't much, but it was a start made of something real instead of something performed, and real starts are rarer and worth more. The partnership announcement went public 6 weeks after the engagement party. It was covered by The Times, The Journal, Bloomberg, and 17 trade outlets whose names most people have never heard, but whose readers make decisions that move money in large quantities. Several of those pieces mentioned me by name. One ran a profile. My inbox became briefly unmanageable in the best possible way: researchers who wanted to collaborate, policymakers who wanted to talk, and 3 universities who wanted to know if I'd consider a visiting lecturer position. Richard Ashford sent me a handwritten note, which felt formal and genuine at the same time. It said, "What you built here will outlast both of us. That's the only kind of work worth doing." I framed it, not as a trophy, as a reminder that I had been right to believe the work mattered, even during all the years when no one in my immediate orbit had thought to ask about it. Claire's wedding was in June, 6 months after the engagement party. The Whitmore Grand again, naturally. I was a guest, not a bridesmaid. We hadn't gotten that far, and that was fine. I wore a different dress, blue this time, bought without looking at the sale tag, which was its own small milestone. Diane found me during the cocktail hour, when the light through the ballroom windows had gone golden and everyone was loose with champagne and goodwill. She stood beside me rather than across from me, which I noticed. "She's happy," Diane said, watching Claire laugh with Preston across the room. "She is," I agreed. A pause, not uncomfortable. "I owe you an apology," Diane said. She kept her eyes on Claire. "Several, probably. I'm not sure I'm equipped to give them all properly." "You don't have to give them all at once." She glanced at me sideways. For the first time in 31 years, she looked almost uncertain. It made her look younger. "I told myself I was protecting Claire," she said, "making sure she had the room she needed. But I think what I was really doing was making sure I had the room I needed. And you just happened to be in the way." It was the most honest thing she had ever said to me. "Thank you," I said, "for saying that." She nodded once, a short, contained movement. Then, "Your work sounds important." "It is." "Good." She straightened slightly. "I'd like to understand it better. If you're willing." I turned and looked at her, this woman who had made my childhood smaller than it needed to be, who was standing next to me now in good faith, with imperfect tools, trying anyway. "I'm willing," I said. My father danced with Claire at the reception. He cried, the open, uncomplicated way fathers cry at weddings when they let themselves. I sat at my table and watched and felt something I hadn't expected to feel, simply glad. Not complicated glad, just glad. Later in the evening, he found me on the terrace, where I'd stepped out for air. The city below was lit up in that way cities have in June, like it's trying to match the occasion. "I've been thinking about something," he said. "Okay. I want to get involved. In the work. Not in an interfering way." He held up a hand. "I'm not suggesting I know anything about climate policy. I don't. But I have money and I have a network, and I've been sitting on both for 20 years without asking where they could actually go." He looked out at the city. "Diane thinks I should talk to you about the foundation side of what you do." Diane suggested that? Last week. Apparently she's been reading about Meridian. I thought about my stepmother, alone in some room, Googling my work. Trying to learn what she had spent years ignoring. People can change. Slowly, reluctantly, and then all at once. "Yes," I said, "let's talk about it." I thought a lot, that year, about what I had wanted from that engagement party. Walking in, underneath all the quiet, I think I had wanted to be seen. To be acknowledged. To have the room reorganize itself and face me. Just once, so that the people who had looked through me for years would finally have to look at me. And that had happened. But sitting on the terrace in June, with my father beside me and the city below, and a year of real, imperfect change slowly accumulating, I understood that being seen had never been the actual thing. Being seen was just the door. What I actually wanted was what came after. The lunch at the diner. The text from Claire about an article. Diane standing beside me instead of across from me, with her imperfect tools, trying anyway. My father asking questions that meant he had been listening. That was it. That was the whole thing. The applause at the engagement party had been the loudest moment of the year. But it was also the least important one. The most important one was a Tuesday morning, unremarkable in every other respect, when my father called just to ask how the work was going, not because he had something to prove or a gap to fill, but because he was finally, genuinely curious about his daughter's life. I talked for an hour. He listened the whole time. That was the moment I had been waiting for. And it was worth every single quiet year it took to get there.